Welcome to the debate. Our discussion today really centers on one of the most pressing economic conflicts of our time. The profound, the disruptive power of advanced technologies like AI and large language models, and specifically how their relentless drive for efficiency clashes quite violently, actually, with the structural requirements of the modern monetary system.
It is a spectacular conflict, isn't it? Because fundamentally, technology pushes towards abundance, more output for less input, while the current financial system, well, it demands scarcity, or at least managed scarcity, and certainly perpetual debt. So AI, representing this kind of peak efficiency, it hits directly against the structural necessity for perpetual inflation that really defines our credit system.
Precisely. And that brings us to the central question we need to grapple with. Does the natural inherent deflationary pressure exerted by AI speed up the maybe inevitable collapse of this current credit-based structure? Or alternatively, will the system successfully co-opt this immense technological power to further its own goals of centralization and control? Now, my position is that AI's productivity really highlights the terminal flaws in a monetary system that fundamentally requires perpetual debt growth and therefore inflation just to survive. It's like a structural time bomb, and AI is, it's accelerating the timer.
I see why you'd think that, focusing on the pure structural mechanics. It's a logical argument, but I come at it from a slightly different angle. I believe the existing financial structure is far more, let's say, active and manipulative than you might characterize it. It's primarily designed for control, and AI, while incredibly efficient, will likely just be funneled into these already very effective centralizing mechanisms. So I see the structure as far more resilient and, frankly, adept at absorbing shocks than it is inherently fragile.
Okay, let's maybe define our positions a bit more clearly then. My core stance is that AI and the increased efficiency it brings naturally lead toward deflation, which I would argue is the natural state of a truly productive market operating freely. This dynamic, this push towards lower prices, exposes the fundamental trap of the credit-based system we live in. I mean, if we look back historically at periods with, say, a sounder, hard money standard, where the money supply is relatively fixed or grows very slowly, productivity gains almost always translate into falling prices. You simply get more value, more stuff, for the same unit of currency.
That's a compelling historical reference, I grant you, but I would argue that framework, that kind of perfectly free market operating under hard money, is largely theoretical today. We just don't live in that world. You are correct, though, that the current system is credit-based, debt must always grow, and inflation is required. But we need to be really clear about why inflation is seen as required by the system's managers. It's because if prices start falling consistently, if we actually enter deflation, the real value of all that outstanding debt just explodes upwards.
Right.
And that immediately undermines the ability of borrowers to repay loans, causing defaults, bankruptcies, and ultimately risking the collapse of the entire systemic framework. So yes, AI certainly speeds up that systemic contradiction by potentially dropping prices much faster than the system is designed to handle.
So you agree then, AI is potentially an existential threat to the current financial structure, not just some minor inconvenience.
Potentially, yes, but the outcome isn't predetermined.
Consider the specific nature of AI's productivity boost. It drives the marginal cost of cognitive labor, tasks that used to require highly paid professionals, towards zero. I mean, a large language model can generate a complex legal brief or write intricate code, tasks that used to take a senior professional maybe days, now potentially in minutes. That efficiency gain is immediate, it's massive, and it is profoundly deflationary by its very nature. It accelerates the exact dynamic the system must avoid at all costs.
I agree that deflation is the natural tendency of this kind of innovation. Absolutely. But I just don't buy that this natural force, powerful as it is, will necessarily override the immense established power of centralized control. We are operating, as I see it, under what you might call the illusion of the free market. The system is already heavily manipulated specifically to prevent natural deflation, and that ensures AI's immense productivity gains are, immediately concentrated rather than distributed broadly through widespread price cuts for consumers.
But how does that concentration actually happen? if the technology itself becomes widely available, almost ubiquitous?
Because the system effectively owns the environment in which the technology operates. Think about it. Every major mechanism, from fractional reserve banking, which creates credit out of thin air, central bank interest rate manipulation, massive corporate bailouts when things go wrong, to the incredibly complex web of regulations, all these exist not primarily to promote general prosperity, but fundamentally to preserve the survival of the debt system itself. You hear influential voices promising an AI productivity miracle. Okay, fine. But look closely at who actually captures the value from these miracles. It's almost always the entities already positioned with vast data reserves, huge computing power, and crucially, privileged access to cheap credit. So productivity gains are routinely, I'd say, stolen by the system, meaning they're absorbed by the entities closest to the credit spigot, concentrated in the hands of a few major players, who then often become, effectively, regulated monopolies, benefiting from that position. AI, in my view, won't necessarily collapse the credit structure. It's more likely to act as an unprecedentedly efficient administrative system of control. It will accelerate wealth concentration at the very top and, perhaps paradoxically, reduce people's agency by making them increasingly dependent on central authorities for income, for access, for everything.
Okay, that really brings us to the core tension here, doesn't it? Is the system's inherent structural fragility, its vulnerability to deflation, the greater factor? Or is its established, deeply embedded control mechanism the dominant force? I still maintain the structural problem is paramount. The debt system's fundamental inability to survive deflation is its ultimate, its terminal weakness. You focus on the monopolies that capture the wealth, but as you know, historically, true, sustainable monopolies have almost always struggled to survive without significant government protection and what we call regulatory capture.
I appreciate the historical context, I really do, but I think you might be understating the sheer scale and sophistication of regulatory capture and financial engineering today. The state is the protection for the financial monopolies, arguably. If the market is already profoundly distorted by central banks aggressively pursuing inflation targets, explicitly fighting deflation, and by regulations designed specifically to shield the large politically connected banks, then the power of that existing centralized control, I think, outweighs your natural market dynamics. The system effectively siphons off those productivity gains before they ever really hit the consumer market as widespread deflation. So AI simply provides this existing, highly refined control structure with more potent, more efficient fuel. It doesn't necessarily break it.
But what if the AI-driven deflation occurs too rapidly, truly exponentially? The debt spirals could happen before the central authorities can even deploy effective countermeasures. This financial system isn't running on solid ground. It's designed, as some say, like a car that must accelerate perpetually just to avoid stalling. If AI forces the market to suddenly slam on the brakes by slashing costs globally across sectors almost simultaneously, the immediate risk is a massive sovereign debt crisis, a collapse of the global bond market. That kind of collapse of the underlying credit structure itself is what I mean by terminal weakness. No amount of control, however sophisticated, can necessarily contain a simultaneous global collapse of asset values that are all ultimately tied back to debt.
I'm not convinced that even the collapse of the bond market, while undoubtedly chaotic, isn't immediately followed by an even more extreme centralization of power. Think about it. If the debt system fractures spectacularly, who steps in as the lender or maybe owner of last resort? It's the central authorities, the government, the central banks. They could potentially seize control of remaining viable assets, nationalize key infrastructure, and then deploy technology, specifically AI, to manage the fallout and allocate resources in a, let's say, declared permanent emergency.
So you actually see AI not primarily as a chaotic, decentralizing force, but ultimately as an advanced tool for centralization and perhaps post-crisis administration.
Absolutely. And that brings us neatly to the second crucial point of contention: whether AI acts more as a catalyst for chaos or as a definitive tool for centralization. My argument leans heavily towards the latter. I think the primary outcome is AI serving as the ultimate system of control. As efficiency and productivity accelerates, wealth concentrates further, which inevitably leads to increased dependency for the majority on central authorities simply to manage the resulting economic inequity and displacement.
But the chaos itself is the systemic threat. It's the unpredictability.
Is it truly unpredictable, or is it manageable chaos from the perspective of those in control? Consider the displacements we're already seeing hints of, particularly of high-wage, white-collar, cognitive labor. When potentially millions of people who were previously well-integrated and comfortable within the system suddenly lose their economic status, do they automatically become radicalized entrepreneurs challenging the system? Or do they become primarily dependent on support? History suggests the latter is more common. This creates immense societal upheaval, yes, but that upheaval, paradoxically, often necessitates even greater control mechanisms. Think about things like expanded universal basic income programs, digital identification systems tied directly to social welfare benefits, maybe even massive surveillance networks, all ostensibly to manage the displaced population. This, I argue, ultimately solidifies centralized power rather than breaking it.
I'm not fully convinced by that line of reasoning, simply because the chaos generated could be unpredictable in its sheer scale and speed. The pace of AI adoption might seriously challenge the regulatory response time. And AI can also serve as an accelerator of chaos in a different way, by forcing a kind of societal reckoning that destabilizes the centralized controls before they can establish that necessary administrative infrastructure you describe.
But those individuals you cite, the displaced professionals, aren't they also often the most deeply reliant on the current credit structure through mortgages, student loans, complex investment vehicles? When we are displaced, their immediate, maybe even existential demand will likely be for systemic stability and aid, not for radical disruption. They'll demand protection from the very deflationary forces that are eroding their debt-based assets and livelihoods. And only the central authorities, realistically, can provide that perceived safety net, which just reinforces the very dependency cycle we're discussing. Their economic pain, ironically, could reinforce the perceived need for a centralized solution.
I see the psychological reluctance, I do. But entrepreneurship, true innovation, often thrives precisely by challenging perceived realities, by breaking scarcity-based assumptions. AI provides the raw efficiency to potentially shatter those scarcity assumptions entirely, opening up possibilities for value creation that centralized control systems just cannot anticipate or effectively regulate. This kind of creative destruction, this chaos, might actually be necessary to dismantle outdated economic models that depend on artificial scarcity and inflation. I mean, if an AI can genuinely perform the core analytical work of, say, 100 lawyers almost instantly, the fundamental value proposition of decades of debt-based tuition or traditional salary structures just dissolves, perhaps overnight. That level of instantaneous value destruction isn't easily managed or channeled.
That assumes, though, that the centralized system allows those disruptive entrepreneurial dynamics to flourish outside of its immediate regulatory perimeter. And that leads us directly to the crucial discussion of alternatives, the idea of opting out.
Exactly. The source material we're drawing from does hint that alternatives exist, or could exist, outside of this perpetual debt expansion cycle. Systems that inherently do not rely on perpetual debt-like. For instance, decentralized, mathematically fixed supply digital assets, they could offer a way to opt out of centralized control. They potentially provide a fundamentally fairer way to store and accumulate wealth precisely because they embrace, rather than fear, the deflation that comes from productivity gains. This demonstrates, I think, that technological innovation can, in fact, potentially bypass the trap of the credit system. If sufficient numbers of people or even businesses begin to price their labor or exchange goods and services in these alternative systems, the very base upon which the fiat debt system rests could begin to erode.
That's certainly a compelling theoretical model for an exit strategy, and I understand its appeal. But we have to consider the sheer scale and pervasiveness of the control structure. While the existence of countersystems is noted, the magnitude of current market manipulation, which literally includes state authorities declaring the natural result of beneficial innovation, deflation, as a dangerous societal enemy, demonstrates the massive power and reach of these centralized authorities.
But the alternative doesn't necessarily need to win outright immediately. It might only need to achieve a critical mass to seriously erode the fiat system's credibility, which arguably is already quite precarious in the eyes of many.
I think I disagree on the ease of reaching that critical mass. The systemic concentration of wealth and the corresponding loss of agency happens for the vast majority of the population within this illusion of the free market we discussed. The centralized structure is actively designed to make escape difficult, inconvenient, and financially unattractive for most people. How? Well, through extensive regulatory friction, for one. Governments mandate that financial institutions enforce strict Know Your Customer (KYC) and anti-money laundering (AML) rules, which effectively prevents seamless, high-volume interaction between the traditional banking system and many decentralized alternatives. They can impose punitive taxation regimes on those attempting to opt out or simply declare certain parallel economic activities non-compliant or illegal. The point is, the centralized system still dictates the primary terms of trade and interaction with the physical world for most people. Paying taxes, servicing mortgages, accessing essential utilities. This makes a large-scale exodus practically very, very difficult for anyone who isn't already independently wealthy or willing to operate entirely outside the mainstream.
But doesn't that constant pressure, that regulatory squeeze, only increase the appeal of genuine financial independence over time? If the existing system becomes visibly less stable, partly because of the deflationary pressures AI imposes, and simultaneously the central authorities attempt to clamp down harder on alternatives, doesn't that just drive up the demand for true, non-confiscatable assets? AI, in this sense, accelerates the visibility of the fiat system's inherent instability and perhaps its increasingly coercive nature. The alternative doesn't have to win in a direct fight. It simply needs to draw enough liquidity, enough trust away from the centralized core to potentially trigger that systemic failure we talked about earlier.
That sounds perhaps a little like wishful thinking, given the depth of the regulatory capture we already witness daily. I maintain that the efficiency gains offered by AI are simply too valuable, too powerful for the central authorities to ignore or to allow them to genuinely destabilize the system they manage. They will, I suspect, simply take the helm of the technological arc itself, integrating AI deeply into their regulatory frameworks, their administrative processes, and ultimately their control mechanisms. Efficiency, in this context, becomes centralization.
So in summary, my view remains fundamentally that the true threat AI poses is primarily to the stability, maybe even the long-term survivability of the credit-based monetary system itself. By accelerating productivity and driving the natural state of deflation, AI forces the fundamental, unsustainable nature of perpetual debt expansion into the cold, hard light of economic reality. And this structural weakness, magnified by unprecedented technological leverage, could very well prove terminal for the current system.
And my conclusion remains that the existing economic power structure is not some passive system just waiting to collapse under external pressure. It is active, it is manipulative, and it is remarkably powerful and adaptive. AI's efficiency gains, I believe, will be immediately captured and harnessed by these powerful centralizing forces. The likely outcome is that wealth concentration accelerates, individual agency is further diminished for many, and the overall system of control simply tightens, irrespective of the mounting deflationary pressure you correctly identify. The structure is far more likely, in my assessment, to adapt to control the technology than it is to be destroyed by its economic side effects.
Well, the interplay between truly revolutionary technological innovation and an inherent, arguably antiquated, monetary structure certainly demands critical scrutiny going forward.
Indeed, and the path forward likely depends entirely on which of these powerful forces, the system's structural weakness or its capacity for centralized control, proves more dominant in absorbing the shockwave that AI is currently sending through the global economy.